So, hello everyone. I'm very glad to read you at the last lecture of before the Christmas, which of the series of the lectures which we organize in parallel to our studio, hardware, software, and architecture at TU Wien. In this studio, we try to find another approach to design buildings in terms of to approach this design from the point of flexibility. We try to design them from the very beginning to imagine that they would be redesigned and reused in the near future without much control of the architect, and the ecology in our studio plays a very important role. And this lecture is dedicated to sustainability, to questions of the green architecture, to reuse. And I'm glad to introduce you Klaus from DoTank, and a couple of words about Klaus. Klaus Kodidek holds a master degree in architecture as well as in School of in Social Design. After being a project assistant at the Urban Design Institute, he has been working for the city of Vienna at Department of Technical Urban Renewal. In January, he will change to the executive group for construction and technology and be part of DoTank Circular Economy 2020-2030. There he'll be responsible for the program phase for the program phase pilot projects. In these terms, I don't think that I have much to add. I would just like to warmly welcome Klaus and pass him the microphone, and after his presentation we will have a discussion with questions and answer, and I would really love all of you actively to participate. Don't forget to write your questions in the chat, and please be active after the lecture. So Klaus, please start.
Thank you, Artem, for this kind introduction, and thank you for having us. By us, I mean Anna-Vera Deinhammer, who unfortunately cannot be here today, but she sends warm wishes to everybody and is very excited that the TU Vienna is focusing on circular economy in the built environment. I'm gonna guide you through today's lecture, and I was asked to give a 30 to 40 minute lecture on circular economy. And Artem told me that some of you students haven't been confronted with the topic of circular economy, and therefore I will give you a short overview and introduction to circular economy in the built environment. I will then focus on pilot projects that we thought might be interesting for you to understand how circular strategies can be implemented in architecture and design, urban design projects. And the third part of the lecture will be an introduction to the DoTank Circular City 2030, and we'll give you an overview of what we have planned at the city of Vienna and how we will implement circular strategies. All right, so let's start with the introduction to circular economy in the built environment. I know 2020 has been a rough year for many of us. We've been facing a major disruption with the global pandemic that we're currently facing. And although the vaccine is around the corner, this crisis will be still with us for quite some time. But, and I know I'm very sorry to start this lecture with such a negative connotation, but besides the COVID crisis, we are in another crisis, namely the global climate crisis. What I've chose here as a background is not some fancy design background, as you know. This is a representation of heat days in Vienna. Each stripe is representing a year. And as you can see to the far right, we are facing more and more urban heat days. So we can see that we are in the midst of a global crisis. Besides that, and I'm very sorry that this slide is in German only, we are confronted with a massive CO2 emission. And when we look at the built environment, the built environment is responsible for 10% of the CO2 emission. So this is the second parameter that we must have in mind when we design buildings, but also when we approach urban design competitions. But, and this is not, and this is also like adding on top to those two parameters, 71.8% of all waste streams in Austria come from the construction industry. And besides that, besides all that waste that we are creating within the construction industry, we face the challenge in the European Union that we can only cover 9% of the raw material supply from our own sources. And when we look at the critical materials, we can, this percentage goes down to 3%. And as if this wasn't enough already, on April 8th, 2020, we had Austria's Overshoot Day, meaning this was the day this year that we've used up all our natural resources. In other words, this means that from April to the end of the year, we're basically exploiting the nature and we're basically exploiting resources. So how can we face those challenges? We can only face them if we foster an interplay of climate protection, the adaptation to climate change, and if we focus on the resource conservation. Because as we all know, Vienna is one of the most livable cities, but in order to keep it that way, we really must focus on three goals, and they are the necessary implementation of the greenhouse gas reduction. Besides that, we need to adapt our built environment to be fit for future purposes and to face the future challenges caused by the climate crisis. And when we design buildings and when we're looking at the urban design challenges, we must strongly and radically reduce the amount of raw material that we consume when we design the buildings. The first slide that I showed you, the accumulation of the heat days, they are basically the result of the climate crisis. And we are facing this climate crisis because there was in the past this lack of climate protection on the one hand, but also it's been realized too late and actions against it were set at were too late. And so there is absolutely no doubt that decarbonization and reducing the 10% of CO2 emission that come from the built environment must be faced, and this must be an overriding goal if we want to preserve our habitat. And since we've acted too late, we're now confronted with those consequences, meaning in Vienna, we are facing urban heat islands, we're confronted with heavy rainfalls. And in order to be prepared for the future, we must adopt our built environment, meaning not only buildings, but also public space, to that climate crisis and to that climate change. So we are fit for a climate friendly and fit future. And what the architecture debate in the last decades has been that if you want to create an eco-friendly architecture or an eco-friendly urban design, basically what you had to do is to reduce the energy that was used during the consumption of the building. So basically, if you face this reality, all you have to do is you have to switch to renewable power, and this problem is basically solved. The rather bigger challenge is that we need to focus on the materials that are used during and for the construction, because those products that we're using for construction, they create massively CO2 in the manufacturing process and are very often made out of finite resources. So this shift in the architecture debate must shift to, or when we talk about truly climate-friendly architecture in the future, we must shift to materials that produce nearly zero emissions when produced, that hardly use any fossil fuels or no fossil fuels at all, and that produce no waste. Because if we do so, and if we use materials where you can check all those boxes, we finally acknowledge the planetary boundaries. And by acknowledging the planetary boundaries, I think we as a city, and we as a city here in Vienna, we will have to acknowledge that the city is rich in materials. And this also means that we must look at buildings as material banks. To give you one example, as of right now, there's more copper in buildings than there's copper in the earth crust. So I think it goes without saying that we have to drastically reduce the material footprint in the urban that's used for the urban fabric, and push towards a circular economy in the built environment. That was basically circular economy in a nutshell. I know I can't go too much into details, and I'd rather focus now on the second part of the lecture, namely the pilot projects. And before I show them, I just want to highlight that we chose a variety of projects, and please look at them more with the lens of, in terms of circular economy rather than the architectural quality. And the aim with the pilot projects that we're showing you today is to give you an overview of how circular strategies can be implemented in different scales, meaning how they can be implemented on an urban design scale down to the scale of an interior design project. And with those pilot projects, we also want to introduce you to different startups and actors within the circular economy field. So the first project that I'm going to show you today is by Rotor. Rotor is an interdisciplinary collective from Brussels, and they've been working on circular economy in the built environment since 2004, the early 2000s. And this project that I'm showing you today is Sporous, which is an abandoned container rail terminal. And what they did there, they examined this abandoned trail area and examined like the materials that were left back at the project sites. And with their new urban design, they tried to implement those materials they found at site and did like just a few design additions to the project sites. For example, they used the concrete pavement blocks that were found, or used earth from the project site to form hills all over the project sites. So it's very incremental, but it's just like to give you an overview on how circular economy could work on an urban design level. When we move more to the building scale, the project that I'm showing here is the Nest unit by Vienna Solbeck, which was realized in 2017. And I think this is a very good example of built circular economy, because it clearly shows that when you want to implement circular strategies, you really have to think of circular economy at the very first design stage. And this building highlights that circular economy, or like thinking in circular economy terms, is not an add-on that you would add on to a project at the very end, but something that you have to think of at the very beginning. Namely, here, when we look at this building, it's based or it's made out of or based on modular systems that are prefabricated, and the building itself is designed for disassembly. And please do not get me wrong, like when I say design for disassembly is something that we strive for, or that we want to create buildings that are only temporary from now on. But this design for disassembly aspect highlights that we never know, and we live in such dynamic worlds, and we never know like what will happen in 20, 30, 40 years. And if you walk through the city with open eyes, you can see deconstruction sites and deconstruction of buildings that are 20 years old, 30 years old, where you would think that those buildings could last longer, but apparently they've reached the end of the life cycle and for some reason cannot be readapted. So it's super important that in the future, we design buildings that they can be disassembled, and that the materials that we use for those buildings can be deconstructed and reused. Because what we strive with circular economy is that we keep the building materials as long and in this reuse circle or in this reuse sphere, and only move them to the recycle sphere if it's really not possible anymore. The next thing I'm going to show you, since we cannot travel, I'm going to take you to the Schiphol airport in Amsterdam. And I know it's a bit ironic that when we talk about CO2 emissions and preserving resources, that I'm going to take you to an airport. But in Amsterdam, they used a very innovative concept, namely light as service. The Amsterdam itself, or the project developers from the airport, cooperated with the lighting company Philips. And what happened there is the owner of the whole lighting infrastructure at the airport is not the airport itself or the company that runs the airport, but still Philips, the provider who produced the lamps. And this is something closely connected to the sharing concept or the sharing economy that is also very helpful when we're thinking about circular economy. Because why? Or what happens? Because like, what happens if the company that produces the product, in this case, the lighting infrastructure, is still in ownership once it's installed in the building? Then they are interested to produce a product that is long lasting. And so here we see what's very important for a circular economy, namely the shift of ownership to the companies or the firms that produce the products. And if this happens, they are interested, of course, to produce a product that is long lasting, and therefore this feeds to the circular economy principle. The next project that I'm going to show you, I'm going to take you back to Vienna, and this is a project I did together with colleagues from the Angewandte and together with Rotor, the initiative I introduced you earlier. A key element of a circular economy is to move away from primary resources and use secondary resources. And the market for secondary resources in Vienna or in Austria in general is at the moment a very small market, and the level of formality varies from the different providers. And this project was done in 2017, and it was done within the Care and Repair exhibition hosted by the Architekturmuseum. And it took place at Nordbahnhof, which you know, is this urban development area within the city. And there's a lot of construction, new construction going on. So what we tried to do is to host an exhibition that shows building materials from different resellers. So what we did is we did field visits to all those material resellers, because as of right now, most of those building material resellers, they aren't really based in Vienna, but more based on the countryside. And so what we did is we took field trips to those different building material resellers. And per material reseller, we chose one building material. And as you can see, from wood panels to tiles for the outside. And we also had this huge concrete block. And then we took this material. We had Martin Röck on our team who did the 3D modeling on all of those different building materials. And we used this as a proof of concept, basically. So we invited project developers, future project developers, and showed them that the secondary building material is available in a large quantity, so that they could work with this building material in their different projects. And they are not only in large quality, but large quantity, but also large quality available. And that you can do a 3D modeling process, so you could still do the integral planning process. Yeah. A second project I did, and I'm going to show you, we later on were asked together with Clara Rosa Rindler-Schantl and Eva Maria Meyer to do an exhibition at the Vienna Design Week in 2018. And in 2018, the Design Week, the headquarters of the Design Week was in the 7th district at the former location of the Sophienspital. And this Sophienspital area is now also an urban project development area. And one of the headquarters was at this building at this building that was built in the late 1990s. And this building that was built in the late 1990s will be deconstructed within the next years. And so when we were asked to do an exhibition at the Vienna Design Week, we were quite critical about that fact. And there were so many designers at the Design Week who showed their fancy design products in really neat spaces and really fancy spaces. And we thought that it's our task to raise awareness and show to the visitors or make it visible that the visitors are walking through a building that's 20 to 30 years old and that will be deconstructed, and that there are materials in this building that could be easily reused at other project sites. So what we did is we marked 8 different components of the buildings with those yellow dots and had small posters next to it where we explained the principles of circular economy and how those different buildings, for example, the tiles or the windows, could be reused at different project sites. And we also then had this small exhibition space where we showed a film on degrowth and had postcards that the different visitors could take home with them. We are staying in Austria, and I'm going to introduce you to an initiative, startup, or design office, the Materialnomaden. Maybe some of you know them, and we're now looking at a project that is more like on the interior scale. The Materialnomaden, they are based in the 10th district of Vienna. Here you see an interior design that is using reused building materials from the OMV, which is the petrol company, they had their headquarter in the Grellgasse before they moved to the Viertel 2. The Glaspalast by Harry Glück in the Rathausstraße, and from Caritas Kierling. If you, Materialnomaden is maybe one of the architecture companies that are focusing on, they do deconstruction, but they also have a strong design focus and architecture focus, and try to rematerialize the different building components. And this is one example to show you that you don't always need to use primary resources or new materials, that sometimes you can also contribute to the principles of circular economy when you use secondary materials in your design projects. And the last case study or pilot project that I'm going to show you is at the end of the life cycle. Artem introduced me and said that I also studied architecture, and I once reflected, and I have to admit that I was hardly confronted with deconstruction during my architecture studies, but the more I work on the topic of circular economy, I realize how important also deconstruction is. And so maybe while you're studying, you also want to take a look at deconstruction and how to implement deconstruction for reuse. And here I want to introduce you to Baukarussell. Baukarussell is a consortium. It's basically consisting of several socioeconomic businesses, such as the Caritas, the DRZ, which is a recycling center in Vienna, Thomas Romm Architects, and Pulswerk. And the project I'm showing you here is the Glaspalast in Harry Glück. It's also the building, also Materialnomaden used building components from this building for their project. And it was realized in 2017. And I think the interesting aspect of this project is not only like the amount of materials they basically saved and reused or made available for reuse, but that with deconstruction for reuse, that they made money, but also it shows that deconstruction for reuse is a manual labor. And I think then we need to jump back to this aspect of the COVID crisis, and that many people are currently looking for jobs, and the job market is quite under challenge, or is facing challenges at the moment. And I think that, or I want to throw this argument into the room, that deconstruction for reuse could be an argument or a way to create jobs, because it is a manual labor and it needs very skilled workers. All right, that was the second part of the lecture, and we're now moving on to the last part, and I'm going to introduce you to the DoTank Circular City 2030. And also, we've been confronted with COVID restrictions, because the DoTank that will be installed at the Executive Group for Construction Technology at the city of Vienna, we actually wanted to launch the DoTank in December, but due to several restrictions, we had to postpone it. And we are hoping that we can launch, or at least do a mini launch in January and the big launch in March, but we'll see. Given the background that, or the introduction, if you keep that in mind, what I told you with the triangle of climate protection, the radical resource conservation, and the climate adaptation, the DoTank is based on the concept, or on 3 domains, or we want to act on 3 domains. Namely, we want to install this DoTank in order to, on a socioeconomic level, we want to focus on the integral planning process because we see this is key. And we also want to focus on the circular construction. So how do we get from the vision to the implementation phase? We conceptualized the implementation in 3 steps that consists of collaboration, innovation, and the initiating part, as well as the scaling part. The first step will be that we are looking for collaboration with different stakeholders, whether they are from the construction industry or architecture offices, but we're also trying to establish networks with different universities, because we think having this exchange with future architects and future urban planners, that this is key, and this could also provide a two-way learning street. So we are actually very happy that we have the chance today to present the DoTank and what we have in mind. The second part is that we focus on the innovation part. Here we're looking for new business models. We think that new business models can be established within the circular framework, but we also want to rethink the construction process management. And a very large part will also be to launch projects, innovative projects. And in order to do so, or very important for this project phase will be that we're launching projects that push forward circular economy strategies, but also then have the feedback loop back to the DoTank and learn from those projects, so that we can scale the learnings all over Vienna. All right. And we strongly believe that a circular city, or a circular city Vienna, fosters not only resilience or prosperity, but also the livability. Like what we really try to do with the DoTank is to create resilient infrastructures, focus on the architectural quality. We want to raise actually the architectural quality by implementing the circular principles. We want to reduce the amounts of raw materials that we're using, but also redistribute the life cycle costs, because as of right now, the developer that constructs a building is the one who is responsible for most of the life cycle costs, while at the end, no one takes care of this cost. So we'll also have to think about the redistribution of life cycle costs. So to give you an overview where the topic stands in Vienna, here's an overview of strategies where it's embedded, where circular economy elements are implemented. First, I want to introduce you. You probably know most of those strategies, but I'm just going to give you an overview. And you've probably also read most of those framework strategies that the city of Vienna is providing. But if you take a close look at the Smart City Framework Strategy that has been updated last year, you will notice that there's a section on buildings there's a whole chapter on buildings, and there is one goal that I want to highlight because it will be very important for all of you future architects, and that is the 2050 goal. And the 2050 goal states that by 2050, buildings that will be deconstructed will have to be reused 80%. So like 80% of the building components have to be reused by 2050. We know that focusing on buildings and focusing on implementing circular economy in the built environment is like our major goal and our major task, but we know that we need to parallel work on other strategic levels and also have to be aware of financial aspects. Therefore, Anna-Vera Deinhammer was very keen or tried to implement those strategies also in the Vienna Economic Council strategy. And there's also this shift, or it states in there that Vienna wants to move from a linear economy, that is the system that we're currently in, towards a circular economy. And that we can only achieve this goal if we preserve primary resources. And the latest edition of strategies is the coalition paper between the SPÖ and NEOS. And in this coalition paper, and this makes us very proud, is the triangle that I introduced you earlier, namely the climate protection, the climate adaptation, and the resource preservation. And we are also very happy that next year, hopefully next year, but we hope by June 21, that we will be able to launch the white paper Circular City. We're currently working on that paper and co-designing that paper with the different departments, such as the Urban Planning Department, the Technical Urban Renewal Office. And we hope that we can launch the white paper Circular City Vienna by June 21. So you will be able to have a guide where Vienna wants to move, or what the goals of the Circular City Vienna are. Okay, this is the program structure that I'm going to run you very quickly, but I thought it might be interesting for you to understand how the DoTank is organized. The program manager is Claudia Schrenk, and Anna-Vera Deinhammer is the project lead of the DoTank. And we focus on different parts. As I mentioned, we focus on the collaboration part, where we are trying to establish new networks and have this exchange with different stakeholders. The digitization part will be a major part, because there will be no way around the digital building twin, meaning this digital tool that tells you what building materials are used in the materials and how they are connected to other building components. And there we are also working with the responsible departments. And I will be the program lead for the phase pilot projects, and my co-lead will be Stefan Sattler from the energy department. And I think this is very interesting, because at all pilot projects that we're launching next year, it will be my responsibility to look or have a look at the resources that go into the projects, and Stefan Sattler will look with the lens of climate protection, meaning he will try to focus on establishing renewable energy communities, or the use of renewable energy. And I think this is very good that in the program phase pilot projects, there's like two that were like quite interdisciplinary there. All right. And to conclude, I'll just gonna show you two projects that we're currently working on. One, as I said, when I introduced you to the reuse of building materials, I told you that the market in Vienna, or in Austria in general, is very small. For example, if you look to Brussels, there Rota established Opalis. I don't know if you know Opalis, but it's an online platform where building material is showcased, and you can see where it's located and in what quantity and what quality. And the market in Austria is rather small, and therefore we launched together with the IÖB, which is the Innovative Public Procurement, a challenge for an online tool where we ask companies, startups, within the field to develop a tool for an online platform that will make it that is feasible to showcase those different materials online, and also that is organized by those companies. This project, the deadline was the end of November. We are currently evaluating the different project proposals, and we're hoping to announce the winner by the end of January. And a second project is the Circular City Wien Mobile. I think I was talking about it earlier that of course we as architects must focus on using secondary, on the one hand using secondary material, but also reducing the materials that we use in the buildings. But besides all those different actions that we can set, we also must focus on raising awareness for circular economy. In order to do so, we are going to launch a challenge next year. It probably will be launched in February for a circular city Wien pavilion. And what we try to do there is to create a mobile infrastructure that is temporary and that is made out of 100% reused building materials, so that you can actually see and experience a reused pavilion. And the aim of the goal is to raise awareness for circular economy or the circular city, and also the DoTank, but also we'll try to establish somehow like an information hub for circular economy. All right. Usually, like at the end of a presentation, you would expect some sort of conclusions, but circular economy itself is at the very beginning, and also we with the DoTank are at the very beginning. And so I thought it would be a more precise way to end these presentations with open questions to open the floor, but also that you can reflect on, and maybe you have got some answers to those questions. The questions that I want to leave you today is that can we finally acknowledge that the planetary boundaries, can we finally see that the resources we are using for our architecture projects are finite? Then how can we increase awareness for this issue? And how can we foster the transdisciplinary exchange? Because this will be key. Then also, like when you do your architecture projects, do you know your materials? Do you know how much CO2 was used to produce those materials? Like think of those materials. Then also, what are the ways, or how can we mind the city? Then a question for you, also like what kind of learning environment would you need in order to be fit for a circular economy? Reflect on what you would need now during your studies that you are ready for reusing building materials, for designing for disassembly. And then also, like, I think one question that we always need to keep in mind when we design architecture projects: maintain or renew, reuse or recycle. Always like try to undergo those questions. And then can we imagine a world without waste, and can we design for disassembly? And having that said, thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Klaus. I hope you can hear me now better. I will start with several questions, and then I see some questions should follow from our students. And to me, I would probably ask just some straightforward questions. What is actually the most popular, the most easy, or the most available material for reuse, which now available on the market in Vienna? What could we use as the main structural material and be sure that it's the most ecological, the most kind of circular material we can imagine now, or we don't have one. I said it will be very straightforward.
Yeah. Good question, actually. But of course, like always, there's like not one size fits it all answer to it. There's, I think this is also something that we need to keep in mind. There will be not this one material that will save us. We always need to look at projects very holistically, and we need to look at those different project sites very holistically, and evaluate what material would be best for the project site and for the project itself. But if I had to do a project for example, what you're doing at Neues Landgut, the Gösserhalle, Inventarhalle, the retrofitting. If you take that, for example, I think in order to have this shift from this linear economy to the circular economy, I think you need to start small. But when you do projects, you always need to evaluate what or how can you implement circular strategies. And I want to bring Renaud Herlingen from Rote to the table, who always said, when we had this discussion, should there be this huge pilot project that is just out of reuse building materials, or how can we move towards a circular economy? He always said, when we sat together with project developers, that, for example, if they build a residential building, if you take the entrance hall, it's quite frequented, and a lot of people are using it, and you will probably see patina very fast. And he suggested, for example, that take the residential building and take the entrance, which is a very small percentage of the whole project, and try to implement their reuse tiles, because it's a very small part of the building. If something goes wrong because the tiles come too late, or it doesn't work out with the project management, the whole project won't collapse. But if you set too high goals, the problem is that you could get frustrated easily with implementing circular strategies. And so therefore, I think always and also in these discussions we're having with project developers, we always try to make them think in circular ways at every project they're launching, and take small steps, but scale it and learn from the projects that you've undertaken. So, for example, if you ask me at the Inventarhalle, it'd probably be, without knowing it too much, and I don't pin me on my answer, but what's very easy is, for example, outside tiles, because they can be reused very easily and can be installed very easily. And then move to the inside. But of course, you have to look at every project very specifically and very site specifically.
Mm-hmm. And if I will rephrase the question, what is the worst material to use for the circular economy? What we have to try really to avoid, which is extremely complex to reuse? Do you have something in your mind, something what we have to really prohibit to use?
Okay. I'm gonna reframe that a bit. You could take the best material that has zero emissions in the production, doesn't create any waste, and doesn't depend on fossil fuels. You could have the super material, super eco-friendly material, but if you implement or install it in the building with other building materials that it cannot be deconstructed anymore, there is no purpose. You know where I'm going with this. So the best building material will only be as good as you install it in the building components. So what I'm trying to say here is that always the cutting down the CO2 emissions in the productions is key, but also think of how you install it in the building, that it can be later dismantled and is designed or constructed for deconstruction.
So it's mainly the idea of using the elements, independent elements, which could be independently reused rather than focus on particular material.
Yes. And also there is this, like, I can post it later in the chat. There's this, it's, I think, a Danish website that has calculated the CO2 that has gone into the production, and they kind of like, you know, these pyramids from nutrition. They made a pyramid for building materials.
I would love to continue with several questions from our students. So questions from Philip. Thanks a lot for your lecture. Do you think that the politics could dictate more ecological strategies required by law nowadays? So he means ban special waste materials, recycle a certain percentage of concrete in order to force that change more quickly. How can we speed up this process of circular economy?
Yeah. To be honest, I think in order to accelerate this process, we all need to think in our daily business, no matter if you're an architect, if you're working in as a politician, a project developer, we always need to think of the circular economy principles and how we can implement them in our daily business. I think this, if everybody at the table would think about how they could move towards a circular economy, this would be a huge win. But when, you know, I look at the city of Vienna, I think where our biggest lever is that we've got with the procurement system, meaning if, for example, we're building quite a lot of schools, we're building residential buildings, and I think here is a huge lever for us as a city, that in the procurement process, we add certain criteria, or like that in the architecture competition, the project wins that uses a certain amount of reused concrete or a certain amount of secondary raw materials. This is one huge lever I think the city itself has. But of course, we also need to foster the collaboration between the different stakeholders.
Okay, thanks. So then there is kind of continuation of this question. You partially replied it, but probably it would be good if you would summarize. Eric asks, what are some of the main obstacles for implementing circular economy in a project today? What do the actors in the building project say when you propose this idea? Actors, he means clients, architects, city, construction companies, and etc. Yeah, if you could comment a bit on this.
Sure. This also refers a bit to the master project I did at Angewandte together with two colleagues. And what we did there is we interviewed several stakeholders from different industries. For example, we talked to building material resellers, for people who are in the discourse, people from the project development, people who work on construction sites, people who work on deconstruction sites, and so on. And there we also raised these questions of what they would need in order to push this topic. For example, we as a city would need a bigger market, because at the moment the market for secondary building materials is rather small. And this is also why we launched this EUB challenge in order to have this online platform like Brussels has with the Opalis network. In the conversations we had with architects, we found out that a lot of architecture studios, and I, of course, don't want to generalize, but aren't really aware of the fact that building material resellers exist. that companies that work with secondary raw materials exist. And there is also maybe part of the problem is like the infrastructure, because most of those building resellers are outside of Vienna, and the level of formality depends from, or varies from reseller to reseller. So some architects, or from a lot of architects, we heard that they weren't aware that secondary billing resellers exist. When we talk to deconstruction companies, I think there's a huge, or it comes down to the financial aspect, that as of right now, it's easier to deconstruct the billing as, you know, in this business as usual type, rather than really deconstruct for reuse. And I think if we change some parameters there, we will see some change. And I mean, this project that I showed by by Baukarussell with the glass blast, it shows that the benefits are quite obvious. But the thing generally with circular economy, or what we need to keep in mind, like there's hardly any low-hanging fruits. Like when we look at energy efficiency, you know, you go into a building, you put in the newest energy supply that is based on renewable energy systems. You do monitoring, and you can easily show the project, the site owner, by how much CO2 you saved with this new energy provider. The thing with circular economy is that there's hardly any low-hanging fruits. A low-hanging fruit that we have identified would be the digital building twin, namely that shows what kind of materials go into the building, and that we think of buildings as material banks, because as of right now, project owners or project developers don't see buildings as material banks. And once there is this change that buildings are seen as material banks, and that at the end of the life cycle, which of course we don't hope that is going to happen soon, because we want, you know, buildings that last for a long time span, then there will be also a change.
Mm-hmm. So we partially replied question of Fabian, why this secondhand shop, secondhand construction materials does exist. So they do exist, if I understand correct.
They do exist, exactly. Like, for example, in the 19th district in Vienna, there is a reseller that focuses on Gründerzeit tiles. And in, I think it's the 10th or 23rd district, I don't remember. He focuses on wood beams, for example, but the big ones, they are located outside of the city, also due to the fact that they need logistic areas where they can store the building material.
And the other question, can we find online some data? So we could look up what is available there, what type of materials, what are the possible dimensions, just to have a clue about this market.
I wish. It's available in Brussels, for example, with the Opalis network that I told you. In Vienna, well, Baukarussell has some materials online, and I think also Materialnomaden has some materials online. But of course, those are two stakeholders, and this huge market, or like a market as it exists for primary resources, it doesn't exist yet in that scale, but we are trying to hope to foster a secondary market with our EUBA challenge. So if, as of right now, you can either look at those two in Vienna, and at you would have to go more into detail and more on the countryside.
Another question. Now, typically, what kind of equipment do we need to reuse well, let's say, to prepare materials to be reused. I'm asking, is it possible to organize this kind of reuse stations right on the construction site? So none of the materials, because it's we in our studio try to develop certain principles as well and also declare them as part of our approach. And one of them is that the building, the waste from the building, or let's say remains of the building, they should not leave construction site. We have to try to reuse them right on the site. So we would also save up on traffic, on the additional kind of reuse probably works. How much work do we usually need to prepare materials, remains of the building, to be integrated again on the construction process?
A tough question, since I'm not really into the project and not really know what kind of materials we're talking about. But we just had a roundtable on Monday, and I don't know who brought it up, but this company wanted to reuse building materials in the second district, and they wanted to do the deconstruction there, and then also do all the processes needed in order to reuse the building materials on site. And they wanted to install all the needed infrastructure there, but couldn't do it because a civic initiative from the surroundings were against it, and formed like this initiative that were against it. And here I'm relying on Renault, who has experience in Brussels, and they did a lot of deconstruction. He always mentioned it's easier, like if you have logistic areas where you can store building material, it's easier to store it there and put it on some sort of platform so that architects can reuse it than reusing the building materials of course, it depends on the building materials, but you know that the time scales of designing the building and deconstructing sometimes do not match, because the company, or like there's an architectural competition, and it's not clear at the very beginning that building components should be reused. So it's quite a logistic challenge to actually reuse the building materials from one project site at the same project sites. If you have logistic areas where you can store it, it's way easier to bring them there and do all the processing that's needed for reuse.
And well, I think we probably, that's the last question I see. If nothing else will show up, we probably can slightly wrap up our presentation and our discussion. And the last question I can see from Matei. He says, thank you. What city or region is nowadays a pioneer of circular economy, to whom we can look up and consider them as a good example? So you mentioned many times already Rotter, but probably something else. I would even probably elaborate this question in this way: which country is the most advanced now in circular economy, and where the system of circular economy functions the best way? And the other, probably you could mention several practices which works probably more, it could be more independent work, which works the most efficient with them within the sphere of circular economy.
Thank you for the question. For example, if we take a close look at Amsterdam, they've already launched their white paper on circular strategies. So if you want to go get more detail on how they visualize and conceptualize their circular strategies in the built environment, you could go to their site. They have an own site and an own already white paper on circular economy, where you can see they've listed pilot project, they've listed where they want to go or take Amsterdam to circular strategies. Then, of course, when it comes to this reuse platform, it's definitely the Brussels and France region, but also Nordic cities are quite on top when it comes to circular economy. But of course, cities are different ecosystems, and you have to look at them very very carefully, and also with the mind that things that work in one city might not work in another city. And of course, we as the city of Vienna are hoping to not only be the most livable city to live in, but also to be the most circular city.
Well, then probably I will finish with this question. I personally was very inspired with your talk and the many questions and problems which you have addressed. They're extremely relevant and extremely important. How can we help DoTank and generally City of Vienna to progress in this? What can we do as an architect, as a future architects, to make it happen, to save the world, to make City of Vienna better, make ecology better, and then for us, our children and future generations to create better planet?
Yeah, I mean, I introduced you to the 2050 goal that states that the buildings by 2050 have to be reusable, or 80% of them have to be reusable. So when you go or when you do your next architecture design project, please design buildings that like the best circular building is the one that we don't have to deconstruct. And in order to do so, and I do not want to romanticize Gründerzeit buildings, but they've been around for 100 years due to their flexible floor plans and their room height. So maybe this is something we can learn from the Gründerzeit. Design buildings that adjust to change, because change is inevitable. And when you design that your building materials are ready for disassembly, not that we want to disassemble or deconstruct the building materials, but in case we have to, that we can, and that we can keep those building materials in the circular loop. And always, no matter what you do, think, how can you reduce the raw materials you're using for your design project? How can you cut CO2 emissions, and how can you make them fit for climate adaptation, meaning that they somehow have protection against the urban heat? And if you always examine your building project or your urban design project by those three aspects, you will create buildings that will be fit for the future.
Thank you. That sounds very inspiring. I hope some of our projects will at least partially satisfy these requirements, and that's exactly the direction we are aiming to. Thank you, Klaus, very much. It was a pleasure to hear your presentation. It's enriched a lot our vision, and have a final happy week for the Christmas. And I hope this year will not continue the way it started in the next year. So we'll continue with a better year, better energy, and better achievements in the next year. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us. And if there's any questions or comments, please reach out to us. We are very open for new ideas and new design concepts.
We will definitely reach you out in the next year. So thank you, everyone, and have a good evening, and goodbye.
Good evening. Bye.